Hi, I'm wanting to follow on from the last video where we were talking about the transcendent function. If you haven't seen that, go back and watch my last video, and we started to touch on what that meant. In a nutshell, the transcendent function is the tertiary function, also known as the third function. I've heard it called the inner child function, I think the God function. So the word transcend means be or go beyond the range or limits. Going beyond the range or limits is really what it alludes to. Because Carl Jung said the transcendent function is the mediator between the conscious, like top dominant function and the inferior function. And I remember him also saying that the inferior function is the one that we value the most. And he also talks about if we manage to use the transcendent function to access the inferior function, it can feel like having a spiritual experience because it's so different to what you're used to, and you can accomplish different things, probably things that were really important to you but you didn't really have a hope of achieving just by using the dominant functions. So it's like the mind has a built-in system to help you access the other stuff that's in there. So your potential is so limitless. And we talked yesterday about how it's important to be in right social standing. They were my words, but have a base level of social acceptability before you can then go on to realize yourself as an individual person, kind of separate from the collective. And the transcendent function is the one that you want, because you're able to gain access to things that feel kind of out of reach to you in your natural state. He describes the whole process of accessing the transcendent function, but I'm not going to go into that today. That's for another video. I'm just going to look at the actual effect of it, really. Okay, so if we think about going back to the video on fantasy, so the conscious, the stuff that's inside the unconscious is constantly trying to make itself known in the conscience. And he's talking here about how the more that happens, the more access you have to this transcendent function. So this function of mediation between the opposites I have termed the transcendent function, by which I mean nothing mysterious, but merely a combined function of conscious and unconscious elements, or as in mathematics, a common function of real and imaginary factors. So the transcendent or third function, it seems to be an amalgamation of things from the unconscious and things from the conscious. The third function may be a mixture of the inferior function, the fourth function, and the first function, or it may just be, you might just want to look at it as unconscious elements from all parts of the psyche and conscious elements all combined together, and it creates this transcendent function. Besides the will, whose importance must not be thereby denied, we have also creative fantasy, an irrational, indistinct function, which alone has the power of yielding the will a content of such a character as can unite the opposites. It is this function which Schiller intuitively apprehended as the source of symbols, but he termed it play instinct, and therefore could make no further use of it for the motivation of the will. In order to obtain this content of the will, he went back to the intellect, and in doing so aligned himself to one side. Okay, so we will do a reading about symbols as well at some point. But I think for all intents and purposes, we can imagine the tertiary or transcendent function as being an amalgamation of sorts of the conscious and unconscious. So you can see why people might get the idea for God or higher power or higher truths, or the belief that they have more potential in them if they're tapped into this transcendent function. The synthetic method develops the symbolic fantasies resulting from the libido, which is introverted through sacrifice. Out of this development, a new attitude towards the world arises, whose very difference guarantees a new potential. This transition to a new attitude I have termed transcendent function. He's talking about tapping into this through sacrifice. The dictionary definition of sacrifice is an act of giving up something valued for the sake of something else regarded as more important or worthy. Maybe you go through a really hard time in life and then you kind of drop things that weren't serving you anymore, and you develop a new attitude because you've now kind of made room for other things to be important to you. We've all experienced this to a greater or lesser degree. Some people experience it in a really profound way at some points in their lives. But just the idea of maybe even via the process of having therapy, bringing into the consciousness your true desires, what really is important to you, and you might not have been aware of that before, and then deciding to drop things that are not serving you anymore. Maybe that's a way of accessing the transcendent function. The transcendent function is the result of a new attitude. So if you're an extroverted sensor, it's where you find your introverted, rational parts. You tapped into those. So there's lots of new potential there, and he's termed it the transcendent function. So it's almost like a function that you're using that's not natural or practiced, but it's very, very important for your growth because it brings about all these new potentials. As he says, it guarantees them solely because it's a new attitude. In the regenerated attitude, the libido that was formerly submerged in the unconscious emerges in the form of positive achievement. It corresponds with a newly won and visible life whose image is the symbol of the divine birth. Yeah, so I might be talking about having one of those very life-changing epiphanies. It's like an epiphany. Conversely, when the libido is withdrawn from the outer objects and sinks into the unconscious, the soul is born in God. This is so interesting, but it's like information overload because it all feeds into different ideas that we also need to read about to understand it as a whole. I guess we're just touching on it. The psychological process of individuation, which is what we were talking about yesterday, is clearly bound up with the so-called transcendent function, since it alone can provide that individual line of development which would be quite unattainable upon the ways dictated by the collective norm. I'm pulling bits and pieces from many pages here, and I'm trying to give context. Okay, so he's talking here about forcing the energy of the opposites into a common channel. So your opposite functions, I'm guessing, will be the dominant and the inferior. So we're not reading about how you would achieve that, but the suspension of life is therewith abolished, and the individual life can encompass a greater range with new energy and goals. How positive is that? In its totality, I have named the process just described as the transcendent function, and here I am not using the term function in the sense of a basic function, but rather as a complex function, compounded of other functions. Neither with transcendent do I wish to designate any metaphysical quality, but merely the fact that by this function, a transition is made possible from the one attitude to the other. It's not a function in the same way as, the dominant, the auxiliary, whatever. It's something that's more complicated. It's almost like a mixture of functions. But he's saying it doesn't work quite in the same way anyway. But basically, if you're an extrovert, you're able to introvert as well, and you're going to find lots of new energy and opportunities there, and vice versa. If you're an introvert, you're able to extrovert. If you're, an intuitive, you're going to be able to tap into the sensation. The raw material, when elaborated by the thesis and antithesis, which in its process of formation reconciles the opposites, is the living symbol. So a symbol, something that represents something, which is then perceived by the dominant and the inferior functions both together at the same time, makes up a symbol that is living. So it can now be acted upon or digested or interfaced with. In the essential rawness of its material, defying time and dissolution, lies its prospective significance, and in the form which its crude material receives through the influence of the opposites, lies its effective power over all the psychic functions. It might be your kind of driving force, or something that you're striving for, the thing like why you're here, your purpose in life. I think in socionics they call it the hidden agenda. Maybe that's what it is. And then when the opposite functions come together to perceive it or judge it, or experience it, so you're not just experiencing it from one extreme, but it's in a completely balanced way. You're going to see this thing as, wow, this is my God, or this is my reason for being alive. Indications of the foundations of the symbol forming process are to be found in the scanty records of the initiation period experienced by founders of religions, for example, Jesus, Satan, Buddha, blah, 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 etc. I don't feel any the wiser, really, but I'm getting the impression that the tertiary function isn't really what we're told it is. It's just another function, but it's the third most important one. It's not. It's a different sort of nature to the other functions. It seems to be an amalgamation of two opposite functions which normally can't really work together because they're opposite. And what they're actually latching onto is a symbol, something that represents something in the person's psyche, and they're giving energy to it from two opposite sides. So it's given it a very special form of energy, and it might be held in great reverence. And it's able to do that because of the existence of the potential of this transcendent function. The mixture of those two, when they come together, they're able to work with this symbol. I feel like my brain's broken, but yeah, let me know what you think about that, and please let me know if I'm just way off. Thank you.